everyone, I'm Uriah Heep, and this is the Great American Novel Series brought to you by The Author's Matrix. Tonight's episode will be Chapter 25 of The Village Idiot, where Nigel looks like has a lot of domestic problems. Let's see what happens. So, without further ado, Chapter 25 of Dan Blanchfield's The Village Idiot.
Chapter 25. A fortnight had passed, and Nigel spent his time at home with his family, but there was little conversation in the house save the usual domestic banter. There was no discussion of the last conversation between Nigel and Fiona about water, so there was a sense of calm in the house. Nigel went about his daily routine, including avoiding meals Fiona cooked in sewage water. He found himself foraging for food on his daily walks that was less tainted by fecal matter as was possible. Although he was cognizant of the ubiquitousness of sewage water in the lives of his family and society, he had never been as keenly aware of how difficult it was to avoid it. "My God!" Nigel exclaimed to himself as he walked around his neighbourhood one morning. He was starved and could not find any establishment anywhere in the vicinity of his flat that served any food that had not had some contact with raw sewage. His last stop that morning was a small, out-of-the-way grocer who displayed fresh fruit outside his store. As Nigel picked up an apple, he saw that it had been freshly washed in raw sewer water, as there was a film on it, and a stench that accompanied it that made him nauseous. He had no choice as he was famished now, and purchased the apple, and rubbed off as much of the fecal matter as possible, and ate it. He trudged a few more blocks searching for more food, but found that none was not tainted. "There is no escaping," Nigel raged to himself. He had tried cleaning up his wife's cooking and eliminating as much of the raw sewage as possible before eating it. But still, the way the food absorbed the sewage was too much to eliminate its effects on his health. He wondered aloud if he too was dying. He had seen the harmful effects of consuming raw sewage on his family late. It was almost as if Fiona was purposely feeding them even more toxic sewage as a means of making her point. Nigel felt it was almost a rebellion against him and the nature of water itself as he watched his wife plunge their meals into ever more significant portions of raw sewage right before his eyes. It would be a week later that Nigel was due back at his university for his reinstatement hearing with the board of directors. He had almost forgotten he was the chair of the science department at the University of London. It was so long ago in his mind that he was suspended from the position he had fought his entire professional life to attain. As his thoughts drifted back to Dr. Higgins, Nigel became aware that this attack on him was well orchestrated, and not just because of that casual conversation about the nature of water in his office. As he made what he believed might be his final walk to the university that morning, anger and pity mingled in his mind for the individual who had plotted against him as he considered the possible end of his academic career. Upon arrival, the university was in quite a stir. Word had drifted to the faculty that the interim dean had passed away the night before, and some of the more established faculty members were calling for a postponement of the proceedings against Nigel. The board of directors held steadfastly to their schedule and called for nary a moment's delay in deciding Nigel's fate. This pleased Dr. Higgins immeasurably, and he took his customary seat in the front row. The room was called to order, and Dr. Billingsworth, confidant of Dr. Higgins, was swiftly voted in by the faculty as the new interim dean. In assuming command, Doctor. Billingsworth proved more fair-minded than Dr. Higgins had expected. He thought he had thoroughly poisoned the water with Dr. Billingsworth regarding Nigel. Still, the esteemed professor was entirely fair-minded and refused to immediately call for a vote to expel Nigel from his position as chair of the science department. As the faculty calmed down after Dr. Billingsworth's triumphant rise to the interim dean, he said, "It is with an unmeasurable sadness that I rise to this position, I assure you all." The faculty all bowed their heads in respect. "Our previous interim dean was loved and valued by all," he continued. "After a few more words, Doctor." Billingsworth concluded his remarks, and the faculty turned their attention to the matter at hand. Dr. Higgins, while he did not like the turn of events, as he felt the previous interim dean would have wasted no time in dispatching Nigel, he was still quite confident that his relentless lobbying amongst the faculty secured Nigel's fate, and his as well. He smiled softly to himself as Dr. Billingsworth continued. "We have come here for a most serious purpose. As we all know, a charge has been made against Dr. Nigel Crumbly that must have a resolution. Our esteemed professor, Dr. Higgins, has revealed to this body that Dr. Crumbly harbours heretical scientific notions that border on lunacy. He has stated emphatically, to more than one person, the notion that the consumption of raw sewage water is the cause of rampant disease and crippling of our populace, and that it has been so throughout human history." The faculty stirred, and sidebar conversations filled the room. Nigel sat in his chair, silent, not making eye contact with anyone, the least of which Dr. Higgins. "Of course," Dr. Billingsworth continued, "that is sheer nonsense. There is no scientific basis for such a notion, nor has there ever been. We have in this hall an assembly of the greatest scientific minds the world has ever known." The faculty appreciated the flattery and believed every word of their new interim dean. Is there anyone among us in this great hall that subscribes to that notion of the nature of water that Dr. Crumbly ascribes to? The hall remained silent. I thought not. Dr. Higgins was beside himself with glee at the remarks by Dr. Billingsworth. His initial caution that his colleague might quail in the pressure of the moment had vanished. Dr. Billingsworth continued, "However, it is only just that this august body assembled here today allows Dr. Crumbly to speak to all of us and defend his position forthrightly before we render our verdict." This was totally out of order, and Dr. Higgins bolted upright as fast as a man whose body had been ravaged by decades of abuse and neglect could stand, and shouted at Dr. Billingsworth, "Sir, this pseudo-scientist among us has perpetrated a fraud against this institution for the better part of a decade now. I have given this board all the evidence necessary to convict and expel. Yet now you wish to hear this lunatic address our esteemed faculty once again. I must object in the most forceful and distinguished manner." The room now erupted, and arguments between faculty members filled the great hall with a din that rendered any normal conversation mute. Nigel remained quiet in his chair, unfazed by the madness around him. Dr. Billingsworth pounded his gavel over and over again until order was restored. As the room finally quieted, Dr. Higgins took his seat, folded his arms quite firmly, and awaited the following words from the new interim dean, forthcoming without delay. "I hereby decree," Dr. Billingsworth declared with much authority, "that despite objections from certain faculty members present here, I believe it is right to give Dr. Crumbly one last opportunity to address the faculty and state his case for reinstatement. He has been charged with the most heinous crime against science and humanity, a crime that in any just society would call for swift punishment. But we, our fellow scientists, have ever more open minds. So given that, we turn the floor over to Dr. Crumbly for his final statement before this board of directors renders their final verdict." Nigel remained sitting in his chair, pondering his fate. What could he possibly say to his colleagues that would change their minds? Should he once again present to them the scientific evidence he spent years learning from Addison Way, and convince the faculty of scientists sitting before him that they have been wrong about the science they had studied and taught all their lives? Would they listen this time? Dr. Billingsworth cleared his throat to break the uncomfortable silence that now permeated the room. "Dr. Crumbly, sir," Dr. Billingsworth said, "the floor is yours." Nigel stood up, moved to the front of the room, and adjusted his tie, stalling for time. He thought of all the times he attempted to tell people about what he had learned from Addison Way, and how he had always been met with damning waves of the hand, outright dismissal, or even hostility from those who felt they knew more than he did. He wondered how this final speech of his professional life would be any different. He was still a young man who had risen to the most incredible heights a scientist could aspire to in his career. But he was exhausted. As he stood there, silently, staring out at the faculty sitting in judgment before him, he wondered what he would say. Dr. Higgins could not stand the silence. He spoke up as Nigel did not. "You see, my fellow esteemed colleagues, this fraud of a scientist standing before you has nothing to say to defend himself to this august body. What defense could he possibly offer that would change any of our minds? How is this day any different than some dozen years ago, when he stood before his undergraduate university and spewed the same nonsense he is asked to defend here now? He was a fool then, he is a fool now." Dr. Higgins said his piece and sat down triumphantly. He was confident of his victory. It was true. There was nothing Nigel could say in his defense that would save his career. He gazed out upon his colleagues one last time. He saw the effects of consuming raw sewage over the decades his fellow scientists endured. Those present in that great hall, every one of them, had the grotesque sores, some oozing and some crusted all over their bodies, that characterized humanity. As they stared at Nigel, he stared back at them. He had seen the effects of a lifetime consumption of raw sewage, but now he saw it more keenly than before. "They are rotting before my very eyes, yet they do not hear what I say," he thought. "Why does humanity live like this when it is so unnecessary? Is there anything else I could say to them now that would have them see what I see?" "He has nothing to say whatsoever, Dr. Billingsworth," Dr. Higgins said triumphantly. "Use the power of your position to bring judgment upon his head, and once and for all rid this esteemed university of this cancer." Dr. Billingsworth waited a moment longer but could not delay any longer, and announced that the board of directors would now vote on Nigel's fate. The vote was taken, and Nigel was removed as chair of the science department and permanently suspended from all duties until he could return before the board and renounce his heretical pseudo-scientific views. To this, Doctor Higgins objected strenuously. He asked to address the board of directors and the faculty, and was granted his request. He spoke for the better part of 5 minutes, excoriating poor Nigel and the board for leaving open the possibility of his ever returning to the university in any capacity. "This is a disgrace!" bellowed Dr. Higgins as he slammed his fist upon the table where the board of directors sat passively. "The leopard does not change its spots, gentlemen. There will be no future date that this charlatan crawls back on his hands and knees to renounce his views. The board owes it to this community of scholars sitting before you to end this miscreant's association with this university. We shall stand for nothing else." Dr. Higgins sat down and brushed a few chunks of hair that had fallen out during his speech. Unbeknownst to everyone in the great hall, Nigel had already left the room and was making his long journey home, even as Dr. Higgins was planting the final knife in his back. His hands thrust firmly in his pockets to keep them warm on this chilly morning, Nigel felt rightly that all was lost as to his career. There was no way forward to his recovery knowing what he did about the nature of water. He would be banished from anywhere in the scientific world he chose to inhabit. The scientific community had rejected him, and restoration of his career was an impossibility. His searing regret overwhelmed him as he looked back at the university for one last time before turning the corner. The regret was not that he failed to save his career, but that he failed to stand for truth steadfastly. He knew the only way to salvage his career was to renounce what he knew to be true. He had not been one way about what he knew to be true all his life, and he cursed himself for that now. It was his academic tentativeness, where he had taken all of his life to make up his mind, that made for the devastating self-reproach he felt now. As the sight of the university disappeared behind him, Nigel noticed the suffering of humanity before him even more keenly than he had ever seen it in his young life. The people he passed on the street now looked even more horrific than the day before. He witnessed the effects of years of consuming raw sewage that left everyone in a state that devastated Nigel. Nigel turned the final corner and saw his flat. It never looked more dismal to him than it did this morning. The lowering clouds and mist that enveloped him now depressed him further. He spied no lights on within his home, and it appeared unoccupied. He climbed a few steps, inserted his key in the lock, turned it ever so slowly, and pushed the door open as he sighed.
So, Nigel's career is done. He's lost everything. The blind cannot see. No matter what Nigel would say, no matter what evidence he would produce, they would not see it. And he's left with his searing regret as he walks into his home to greet his family. Well, that ends this chapter 25. And next time, chapter 26, what happens as he enters that door? We'll see. Until then, this is your Uriah Heep. This is my Literary Cafe. Goodbye, good luck, and we'll see you next time.